Right now, we're creating policies that in many ways exist in a moral vacuum. And sometimes I think the dehumanization of migrants happens because we haven't heard stories that insist on complexity and nuance.
Hi, I'm Isabel Hugon, and this is Borderline. Yes, this is Borderline. Apologies for a quiet feed. I went to Italy and I brought back COVID as a souvenir. I avoided it for 2 years, and I'm glad I did. It's quite unpleasant, even when you're triple jabbed, and you should be triple jabbed. Sorry if I sound like I just ran a marathon. I really haven't. I just walked in from the other room. So we're going to keep this intro short and sweet, though you know me, it's unlikely. Before COVID, luckily, I chatted with someone who's been on my podcast wish list for a long time. That's American journalist Jose Antonio Vargas. I first met Jose nearly a decade ago. At the time, he had just done one of the bravest things I've seen a journalist do. In an essay for the New York Times Sunday magazine, Jose outed himself as an undocumented immigrant. Jose Antonio Vargas was born in the Philippines, and when he was 12 years old, his mom put him on a plane to the United States to live with his grandparents, who were legal residents there. And only years later, when he attempted to get a driver's license, did Jose realize that he was living in a country without permission, without the right papers. After he chose to write his story, Jose became a public face and a public voice, and a thoughtful, compassionate, and fascinating one at that, for unauthorized immigrants in the United States. He's done documentaries, written a book, crisscrossed the country, which he can neither leave nor stay in, and started an organization called Define American. Now, some of the most interesting work, to me at least, that Define American does is to try to humanize the immigrant story by working with people in TV and movies to tell more realistic, more complete stories of immigrants and of immigration. Now, humanizing the immigration story, I hope that's something of a mission that we share. So we talked about all of that and more. There's a slightly longer uncut version of our conversation on the YouTube channel, but the gist really is here on the podcast. Here is my conversation with Jose Antonio Vargas. Thank you so much for joining Borderline. I'm so glad we're doing this. You were kind of on my wish list for a long time.
Mm.
Um, I have a question that I often start with, and I'm quite curious to hear your take on it, um, which is, what or where is home for you?
Um, well, I mean, I think that's probably going to be the work of my life is to try to answer that question for myself and for other people. But I think me directly, I think it's really evolved. Um, and I would say right now, home is where I can do my work. I'm starting to realize that, like, like, there's a way of working when you're in your 20s and 30s. But now I'm 41, and I think the way I work is still not. I need to figure out for myself what the balance is between working and living, and how I can work so I can live. Right? Like, I'm the kind of person that when I have a project in front of me, it's kind of all consuming, you know,
Hmm.
and I'm totally consumed by this book that I'm writing. And so, home is where I can do that work, and it doesn't matter if it's at the airport terminal or at a coffee shop somewhere or at a hotel room. It's where I feel like the most productive and the most engaged.
Hmm. It's a
Yeah.
very journalist answer. Or just a
Yeah, I mean,
professional type, I think.
but but my work has always been, yeah, I mean, journalism is kind of my my background, but I think it's interesting. Like, I think being a journalist has been I think it's probably one of my identities and it's probably the identity that I figured out and most comfortably own before all the other ones. I don't know what, being Filipino means, or being gay, or being undocumented, or being American. I think being a journalist was always a way to like question myself and question what those things really mean. And then how do I just found this, I'm kind of a walking Toni Morrison encyclopedia. And she has this great speech where she talks about one of the things that we have to figure out is how do you narrate the self without erasing other people, right?
Mm,
Like how do you narrate the self, right? And not what people project onto you, but you, right? And how do you do that without erasing another person's existence? I would say that that's like one of our core challenges as we become more connected and disconnected.
tell me more about that. I mean, it's no, it's fascinating because there is an element of defining who we are, which comes with, um, defining who isn't like us or who we aren't. And in journalism, certainly we do that a lot. Who gets the label and who doesn't, and uh,
And whose labels are we? Whose definitions are we going to oblige? Right? Which definitions are we going by? I mean, I'm in many conversations where I think I'm always the one saying, "Wait a second, like, are we on the? Do we have the same definition for what we're talking about?" Right? And I would argue that all definitions are suspect.
which is interesting for someone who started an organization called
Called
Define
Define
American.
American. Well, I mean, to me, that to me is the most the most potent part of that is the question. It didn't say Define American period. It said Define American question mark.
Mm,
Right. And I think it's not. And I think that's the invitation to conversation. That's the invitation to like provocation. Right. That's the invitation to question. Right. Which to me as an American is probably the most American thing about me. It's the fact that I, I have the audacity to question a place that legally I don't even belong to, right? Like, what's more American than that, right? Isn't that what
yeah.
Toni Morrison was doing in her work? It was Baldwin was doing with his work. Um, all these people who are only marginalized because of the laws that have been constructed, right? Like they were born free, and America told them that they were born free, and then America said, "No, you're not." So it's like this challenge of going up against, you know, other people's definitions and claiming yourself and finding language for yourself that like for example, I get called an activist or an advocate a lot. And I've resisted it for like a decade now. And I finally found a language why, which is so why is it that only a certain portion of population get to be activists? So what's everybody else? I feel like it exonerates everybody else from like taking responsibility for the country and for the world that we inhabit together, right?
Mm.
Like, if I'm an activist, then what are you? What are other people? Right? Like the people just get to be not active? Is that kind of inactivity? Did has that gotten us to where we are?
Is it that because when you're in a way, standing up for the status quo or defending the status quo or not doing anything which is kind of like defending the status quo, then you're like the default. But if you're speaking up for anything else, then you're an activist,
Then
in
you're
that.
an activist. It's kind of like, it's I've been fascinated watching a lot of these artists who are like, I'm an artist, I'm not an activist. And yet there are many people whose very art is dependent on saying I'm not what you think I am, or this is not what you think it is, right? And yet there are people, and this is where I think race and class comes into play, like people who happen to be white just get to be, you know, artists. And yet when it's someone from a marginalized community, all of a sudden they're an activist. I think that's probably for me in the beginning. I remembered, you know, almost a decade ago now, it was one of the first things, one of the first events I had to do after I had come out as undocumented, right? Publicly claiming who I am as a person and blah, 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 blah. And I was at this event, and this person said, the former journalist introduced me and said, the former journalist, now immigrant rights activist, Jose Antonio Vargas. And I had just started doing this work, and I'm like, wait a second, like I am a journalist. Like that's so wait, when did I become a former? Like when did that happen? And then when did I become an activist? Once I started telling you that I'm not who you think I am, and that I actually have to like name what this is that people can't even name, right? Like back then, you know, this is what 2011, 2012, right? When immigration, um, in many ways, I mean, even now in this country, immigration doesn't, it has not a priority for progressives, right? I mean, I think there's been numerous polls that legalizing people in America is usually a lower priority than legalizing marijuana, right? Which, by the way, I've never smoked pot. I hear it's amazing. I think it's great that people can legally smoke pot. I think people should legally be allowed to smoke pot, but I just find it really indicative of our culture that that's a higher priority than legalizing people.
Mm. Okay, there's a lot in there which touches on a lot of topics that I actually wanted to get into, so it's great. I'm just debating which one to get into first. But since you're talking about progressive politics, um you started this work kind of publicly, under the Obama administration, which was
Yeah.
progressive, in name, but was deporting a record number of people.
Yeah, I mean, yes, the very year I publicly announced that I'm here illegally, Obama had deported that year 400,000 people,
Mm,
right? Um, and they can make qualms around, oh, we had arrested people at the border, so you can't really count that as one person. But they had, and again, I think what's happening in Ukraine right now, and the refugee situation in Ukraine and that horrible, horrific tragedy, and the fact that we must welcome what 4 million people who have been displaced. I think more than that. So internally within Ukraine and then within
yeah,
neighboring countries, the United States right now I think is in the process of processing 100,000 Ukrainian refugees who have claims to asylum, which is, by the way, it's legal to claim asylum, right? You have a right to claim asylum.
yeah,
Now,
and
you
you
may
can't
be
cap that.
denied, can't cap that. You may be denied, right? But it's to me, it's so jarring in the most fundamental way to see how how human beings who are Ukrainians are being treated and talked about and contextualized versus people coming from, African countries or Central American countries. Like, what is that about, right?
Hmm.
And I, as you noted, so I started this organization during the Obama era. I was arrested at the border, at the U.S. Mexico border, during the Obama era, right? When all those young, you know kids as young as 3 to as old as 14, walking from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, all the way to Mexico, all the way to the U.S. Mexico border. And I could probably count in one hand how many times those kids, now we're talking about children, were talked about as either refugees or asylees. They were either called migrants or unaccompanied minors, or to some extent even illegal immigrants. These illegal immigrant children. I remember seeing a headline on like CBS News. These illegal immigrant children, and I will never forget you know, the language that Hillary Clinton, who had been a champion for children ever since, her public profile was rising in Arkansas when Bill Clinton was in the governorship. Even Hillary Clinton was imprisoned by the language that we use on this issue, that she couldn't even call those children children, right? I think there was an interview she did with Jorge Ramos, and she basically said, go back, don't come.
Which we heard again recently from
Which we heard again
Kamala
recently.
Harris. And so
Kamala
I'm
Harris.
wondering, after the Trump years, which were extremely aggressive in the rhetoric and the policies, the Biden campaign kind of promised something different. And I wonder, what it's like over there. I haven't been in the States in a couple years, but is it is it really different? What is it like?
Well, it took the Biden administration about a year to lift Title 42, right? Which is that, the Trump administration used the pandemic to say that, we should violate our own laws and not allow people to claim, for asylum, to apply for asylum. So that was just lifted, or it's going to be lifted actually in May 23rd, I think is what they said. Took the Biden administration a year to do that. I think in some ways, this Democratic administration is showing us, again, the limitations of both of these parties, right? Yeah, Democrats, many of whom come from immigrant families. Alex Padilla, the new senator from California, speaks really eloquently and clearly about his immigrant background, and the fact that he's a champion for immigrant rights because he's talking about his family, right? Bob Menendez, from New Jersey, who's been a consistent, loyal, um, you know, a consistent champion for immigrant rights. Dick Durbin from Illinois, one of the chief architects of the Dream Act, which, by the way, is still not law in this country, right? So those are like the usual people that that have been supported, but the reality is they're running up against a system and a structure in which we can call immigrants essential labor, but we don't think of them as essential people, right? I think there was a quote that I read either in the Economist, a magazine that I really should read a lot more than I do, come to think of it. um, there was a quote about some MP who said, "We wanted workers and they sent us people."
Mm.
Right? Like, where would the global economy be without migrant workers?
And at the same time, every time that you make that sort of economic argument for immigration, I feel like it's kind of a dangerous slope to kind of be
Mm.
utilitarian in
Well,
the
actually,
way that we
yeah,
look at immigrants and especially refugees.
especially, well, that's actually why I'm bringing it up because I'm realizing, a decade into this work, that focusing on immigrants as labor has been counterproductive in many ways. Again, it has shown us the limitations of 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 looking at this as an economic argument, right? And the thing that I'm questioning a lot about myself these days is the limitations of empathy. Is empathy, which is something I pray for, something that I hope my work traffics in empathy. But at the same time, how can we talk about empathy with the kind of awareness, hyper awareness of the power structures that exist? At the end of the day, people get up every day thinking about themselves and what ails them and what worries them and their concerns. They're not getting up every day thinking about me, right? Or why is it that I'm still undocumented? There are structures and there are systems bigger than just all of us. And so, how can we act as individuals, but at the same time make sure that we are aware of and are actively dismantling structures and systems that are in direct conflict with our individual principles? Does that make sense? What I'm trying to say?
Yeah, it does. It does. Well, I mean, you mentioned yeah, traffic and empathy. Um, I
Yeah. Is it
think,
a green light? Is it yellow? Is it red? Like, I ask myself, I tell stories. And why do we tell stories? Roger Ebert, the movie critic, called it an empathy machine, right?
but it does work in that you encounter. I mean, in the work that I do, I often encounter people who have instinctive kind of anti-immigration reaction because
Mm,
that's the rhetoric they've heard so much. And I actually find that it's usually quite possible to change their mind within a 5 or 10 minute conversation when you start giving concrete example. They're like, "Oh, we don't want immigrants at
yes.
all, right?" And then you're like, "Well, about what about this person from Ukraine, or what about this person from Haiti? Here's what happened to them. Here's what they're
Once
contributing," and
once
then
you personalize it,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
and so one of the shows that I binged over lockdown actually was Superstore, and when you have this character Mateo who learns that he's undocumented, I was like, huh. That really looks like Jose's story, and then I googled it, and I'm like, oh, it is Jose's story. So can you tell me a bit about that work that you're doing and sort of what you're going through pop
Yeah.
culture to get to
Well,
us?
I mean, let me just say that I am like a product of popular culture. I mean, I think I knew about America before even arriving at America to America because of popular culture, right? Like Home Alone, Roseanne, Whitney Houston, Mike. I didn't know Whitney Houston and Michael Jackson were black until I got here. They were just Americans. The Philippines was the first exercise in empire building for the States, for the United States. So apparently, the Philippines is the most Americanized of all the Asian countries. I don't know this,
I
but that's what
believe
people
that,
say.
yeah.
So, I'm a product of it. I mean, I speak the way that I do because I consumed everything at the Mountain View Public Library, right? And borrowed every movie, every VHS tape from Blockbuster. Remember Blockbuster when that was like a
Hmm.
big thing? So every immigrant will tell you that the first thing we know about America we learn from the screen, maybe a television show or a movie. So that was always an interest of mine. And given the limitations of of enacting any sort of immigration reform at the federal level or the national level, one of the first things I really did before I even started Define American was to kind of do a landscape analysis of where everybody is. And this is again, I think the journalist in me. Like who are all the organizations? What do they all do? What lane do they occupy? And then pretty early on, it surfaced, became clear that narrative was kind of this uncharted territory, right? Meaning narrative as a system of stories, not just one individual story like mine, but where does the individual story exist in a constellation of stories, right? So you hear it on TV, you listen to it on the radio, you read it in a book, you watch it on a TV show or a movie. So because that terrain was in many ways virgin territory, you could really look at, for example, the LGBTQ movement, right? When I was in high school when Will and Grace was the number one show on television. I was in middle school when Ellen DeGeneres came out as gay, right, on the cover of Time magazine.
Hmm.
So I always saw those as like a way to get people to understand what they think of as other or what they think of as not them, right? So we took that strategy and looked at organizations like GLAAD, right? Which has been very, very successful here in the United States. So much so that they have an award show every year that it's like an actual thing that honors representation of LGBTQ people in the media. It's fascinating to me how that has become a real thing. And representation of immigrants is nowhere near that, right? So the Hollywood working on and filming movies, is become kind of our flagship program. We started it with Superstore. It was actually our first consulting project, and we reached out to them because they knew that they were inspired. There's how many undocumented gay Filipinos do you see on television? You know what I mean? So we reached out. And it was so interesting because they said they were going to introduce this character, and then I remember one of the initial conversations was, "Oh yeah, we'll make the character legal by like the end of the season or something."
Magic trick, like,
Like what is that? Some sort of
yeah,
like
that doesn't
immigration
happen.
reform by immaculate conception? Like how does that happen,
Yeah.
right? And but remember, this was Trump who had been elected president, so even people who mean well had no idea that you couldn't just poof, you're a U.S. citizen,
Hmm.
right? The number one question I get, and here I am doing this work for more than a decade, is still, why don't you just get legal? That is the
Yeah.
number one question. So what is that about? That's about narrative. That's about story. That's about information, right? People have no idea. So using that character, so we worked on that show for what, 4 or 5 seasons. Whenever there was a, and what I loved about Mateo as a character is that he really avoided all the tropes. Like he wasn't a good immigrant or a bad immigrant. He was just an immigrant. He could kind of be an asshole because people can be an asshole,
Mm,
right? He wasn't like some perfect immigrant. He had, he wanted to date, right? I love that he's a part of a community. That episode when ICE came looking out for him, and you saw the coworkers, right, trying to like protect him, trying to figure out what to do. Like that's real, right? And I'm just glad that we were able to work on, as we remember it, it's the first regular character on network TV, and mind you, that was broadcast TV. That's an undocumented character,
mhm,
right? So we read the scripts, we consulted on the character, and then that became the jumping off point to it's now become a really robust consulting program. I think we're up to more than 100 television shows and films. And we focus specifically on TV because it's about characters, right? You follow a character from one episode to the next. And so you develop kind of a parasocial, you know, like, I mean, sometimes I still think of myself as like, I'm like a I'm like the Filipino gay version of Frasier and Niles put together. I have developed such a relationship with Frasier and Niles, right? Like, because of all the episodes I consumed of Frasier, that like that has become a thing for me. Anne of Green Gables, Anne Shirley, following her from
mhm.
like Anne of Green Gables to Anne of Avonlea. I mean, I can't believe I just said that out loud. Um,
That's
but
okay.
right,
I also binged that in lockdown, so you're speaking my language.
so and the thing about this too is like when you follow the characters, one of the things that has become clear to me, especially because before the pandemic I was traveling nonstop across the country, is most people, most Americans, um, specifically white Americans, live in predominantly white towns and have predominantly white friends. Meaning the only time they meet a person of color and or an immigrant is through the media they consume. So
Mhm.
what? I'm going to leave it up to Fox News. I'm going to leave it up to conservative talk radio, right? Like we have to intervene, right? And so in many ways, that's our work is intervention.
Mm. And it is super powerful because one of the shows that I read that you worked on is Roswell.
Ah,
Um,
yes,
and that so for me, that's a meaningful one because there was another Roswell. There was the original Roswell when I
the
was a
original
teenager, and I
Roswell.
was
Yes,
obsessed with it. And but now looking at it as as someone who knows better, I realize that original Roswell just completely erased the immigration story, which was in the
hmm
original books. Every character was white. The whole metaphor of, aliens as immigrants, etc., completely disappeared, and they just kind of whitewashed the whole thing. And so now you have this new generation just getting a completely different story, and it just feels like something that just wasn't on TV 20 years ago.
and thank you for saying that because I think people forget that there was an original Roswell. I think it was the was it the UPN or CW or
Oh my, it was a whole thing. It was WB, like before
WB
CW, and then there was a
WB?
whole fan campaign. It got canceled. There was a whole fan
There
campaign
was
which
a
I
whole fan campaign.
participated in when I was like 17 years old to get it saved. Where the network executives were inundated with Tabasco bottles because the characters eat a
Okay,
lot
see,
of Tabasco,
I didn't know
and
all of I didn't know all of
and
that.
and it got picked up by UPN for a third season, and final, it was really, really bad, and then it got canceled. It was a whole thing, yeah.
But we loved working on that show. I mean, again, there's especially now, this is like the golden age of television. I don't even really know. And again, I find this really exciting as a storyteller is that when is it a limited series or a movie, or when is it like episodic? Meaning deciding, deciding how to tell a story and how many ways the story can be told is a question we're actually asking now, right? And so, in this golden age of television, um, given that we're still a relatively small nonprofit organization, we can't do everything. So we've decided that we're doing move like our kind of anchor is movable middle. So we're consulting on we actively want to consult on shows that reach what we call the movable middle, right? So it's not like the rabid anti-immigrant right or the pro-immigrant left, which is really, if you look at the numbers, not that big. So the
Mm.
base for support for immigrant rights in this country is not terribly big. That's why you don't see people protesting, right? You don't. There's just not a lot of um, energy in that way. Now, mind you, I'm not minimizing at all the activism that is happening. Clearly, as someone who's friends with many activists and organizers and advocates, that's happening. But even after the Trump era, or now that we're out of the Trump era, it's been interesting how even though nothing relatively little has changed for the lives of immigrants in this country, especially undocumented immigrants, you don't see it, kind of covered with the same kind of like alarm bells. I mean, I remember one of the first things I had to keep telling people during the Trump era was that Obama didn't have that great a history with immigrant rights. And progressives didn't want to hear that.
Mm-mm.
They were like, wait, what? What about Obama? Right? So I think realizing that this is a product of a bipartisan mess, and that what's happening, the status quo is the way that it is because in many ways we prioritize labor over people. So long as they're doing the work,
Yeah.
you know,
So that we keep the US, I'm not there, but we keep the undocumented migrants because we need them to do the work, but we also don't care enough about them as people
yep,
to, make their lives easier and give them documents and status.
yep, yep. And that to me is what's and look, as you know, I'm not able to see the world, not yet. um and and maybe because of that limitation, I always push myself to think about the global context. So what does this mean globally, right? In the era of like Amazon Prime, in the era of iPhones, in which consumerism is absolutely global, markets are completely interdependent. Um, and yet these workers, documented or undocumented, right? There's a kind of it feels like we have yet to find some sort of language that talks about how borderless business and money is, and how people are still very much, you know, locked up by these borders
Yes,
and
yes.
by these limitations, right? And I'm trying to understand what kind of narrative, what are the narrative shifts that we all need to work on so that people can actually be free to move from one country to the next if they want to. Because that's the other thing, is that I think one of the things we have bastardized is most people don't want to move. Most people want to stay where they are. And of course that's more than okay, which means that the people who decide to move, who decide to leave what they know, what they know to go to a place that they don't know, that is an act of courage. That's a courageous thing to do.
Mm. There's there's a lot there that I've been thinking about a lot, and in these interviews I've been having. One is that the backlash against globalization has turned against people much more easily because in a way it's something that's probably easier to understand, when you
Hmm.
see, people from somewhere else arrive in your country or people crossing borders in a way that it hasn't turns against, flows of trade, of capital, of products. And so during the pandemic, there was this instinct to close and our borders and be safe, and it was travel restrictions, and but obviously we couldn't do without trade from other places because our economies are so interlinked. But we were, quite okay with closing the door to people. Um, and in a way, it's easier to be mad at an immigrant than it is to be mad at a company that is, offshoring its profits. And
Mm.
I, I don't know if there's a question there, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. In that the immigrant is an easier representation of a global world that we
Yes.
can't quite control and that we don't quite understand.
Don't quite, and by the way, that we benefit from, right? Like I mean, whenever I try. Sometimes it's really hard because you're like, I don't want to buy from Amazon. I want to support local businesses, and then, but there are sometimes when it's like Amazon is really the quickest thing, and I have to say, the way Amazon Prime is structured, right? It's like, whoa, like what is this? But then I think to myself, whenever if I make that purchase, what are the actual consequences of that I don't even know, right? Like the kind of the unseen, you know, irrigation system that once we do that, who's benefiting, who's not benefiting, whose money, um, and now having traveled all over the United States and you see towns that have been decimated, since the 80s, right? Because the labor market, because the businesses have moved, they moved offshore, right? I think we absolutely must address that. We absolutely must address like how globalization, right, has impacted like direct families. I mean, I think that's something I don't know about you, but I feel like in many ways we haven't really told that story as much as we should to, to really understand the global economy at play.
And how it has forced people to move who, as you say, don't want to move because there are plenty. There has to be a right to stay at
There has
home if that's what you wish.
I'm still sitting with this, and it happened what 2 years ago now, before the pandemic, certainly. Like I ended up writing a book um, a few years ago, 3 years ago now, and it's called Dear America. And colleges, to my surprise, probably the most surprising thing is colleges are like assigning it, right? Like to read. And the freshmen at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, which is like a conservative area, some dean decided that all the freshmen ought to read my book. And so they bought a lot of copies. My publisher was like, you should go. So I went. And I had to give like a convocation, met the students, predominantly white students from predominantly conservative families. I remember one woman came up to me and said, for Christmas, her grandmother gave her Rush Limbaugh books every year,
Nice.
right?
Sets the stage right there.
Sets the stage, right? And so during the convocation, I gave a little thing, and then there was a Q&A. This young man gets up and says, Mr. Vargas, in the book, you said that your mom doesn't regret sending you here to America from the Philippines because you look how you turned out. And then he goes, do you regret being sent here? And he asked this in front of like 2,000 other people while I'm up on stage by myself looking like a hot ass mess, I'm sure. And I remember pausing and going, yes, I regret it. That if I had had a choice, if I had had a say in the matter as a 12-year-old, I would have told my mom, don't do that. I know that you mean well. I know that you want better for me, but what's actually better for me is to have you as my mom.
Mm.
Now, when do we talk about that in the immigrant rights movement? Like, where is that conversation, right? Because I don't think we talk about that enough. And I guess I'm quote unquote successful. I don't really know what that means. I'm defining for myself what that means. But relationships are hard for me. And I think some part of me got left in on that plane when my mom said goodbye. And if I could do it again, I would have said, no, I want to stay.
Mm.
And to me, that kind of complexity, I have just seen, by the way, a movie called The Lost Daughter. I don't know if you've seen this. It's on Netflix. Olivia
I haven't
Colman
yet.
is in it. And it's so totally not my story in any way. It's just a story of this mother who it hopefully I'm not outing the thing. And if you have not seen it, I suggest you see it because it's just I mean I felt like I was being told the secret that I wasn't supposed to know. After I saw the movie, by the way, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, can we do a thing where like 90% of movies are directed and written by women? Like,
Yes,
can we just
please.
do that? Because I think we would, as a society, benefit so much more if we heard a lot of these truths that we haven't heard. Because we're not women. I'm not a woman, right? So in the movie, this character ends up leaving. She called them abandoning her two daughters for 3 years, right?
Mm.
She left them for 3 years because she just couldn't do it. There was a line in the movie, and she said, "Children are a crushing responsibility. Children are a crushing responsibility." Again, you feel like you're watching this movie that was like it kept dropping these bombs to me at least. So this character that Olivia Colman plays says, I left, and then Dakota Johnson's character asked, "How did it feel?" And then Olivia says, "It felt amazing."
Yeah, nobody's ready for a mother to say that.
But watching that character, which is really a character study, this film, and Jessie Buckley plays Olivia Colman's younger daughter, watching them in this film show the birth, the consequences of Olivia Colman leaving, abandoning her children for 3 years. 3 years. Okay. Talk about empathy. It was so interesting how watching that character gave me gave me a different kind of language to empathize with my mom. Although it's completely different.
Mm.
Although in my head when I was a kid I was abandoned. I was not. She sent me here to for a better life, but she left. It's been almost 30 years. But watching what Olivia Colman had to live with and made me see my mom in like a really different way. Isn't that the and mind you, this is why to me art is so amazing in this way, right? Like what does a Filipina woman have to do with Olivia Colman's character, who's some professor of Italian translation, you know? But in the human condition part, there was that connective tissue. And you know what? I was just at the Oscars because my friend invited me as her guest, and she's a governor of the Academy, so she got great seats. And I got to see Olivia Colman, and I saw her outside in like the waiting area by herself. I just went up to her. I went up to her and I told her this in like 45 seconds. And and she just looked. She was exactly as you'd imagine she'd be. She was so like present, and I could tell she had all these questions undocumented. Like I could tell that she was processing what I was saying. But
Mhm.
basically, I just thanked her. I told her that she made me see my mom in a way that I didn't before, in terms of what this has meant for her, the separation of almost 30 years.
Mm. And that's the power of story,
That's the
right?
power of story. I don't know. How do you quantify that? How do I measure that? That's different from 300 people showed up at a rally,
Mm.
right? Or these are the 1,000 signatures that we collected. I don't think it's less valid, but it's real. It's tangible, right? So actually, at Define American, one of our newest hires is this wonderful woman, who's our measurement and learning specialist. So she's taking everything we're doing in the storytelling realm, Hollywood, journalism, digital storytelling. How do we measure success qualitatively and quantitatively and qualitatively? Like, how do we do that? Right?
How do you? You don't have the answer yet?
We're figuring that out.
Okay.
And
Next interview.
we're figuring that out. And I think, because again, to me, I think narrative is not a slice of the pie, it's actually the pan. So I think trying to understand in many ways what we face in this country and in the world are narrative challenges, because we've been told all these stories, right? What Toni Morrison calls the master narrative of history, the master narrative of fiction. I mean, as I'm so glad that we're finally living at a time when the British royalty is going to Jamaica, and the master narrative is being questioned, right? Saying, wait a second, like we did not want to be, we don't want to be your subjects. Whose decision was this? Right? So like we are questioning narratives, and at a time of media, just the fracturing of media for good and bad, right? I think having strategies that are not one size fits all. Like we could have just said that Define American is only focusing on Hollywood, but that's not enough. What about the news? What about YouTube videos? When you go on YouTube right now, you type immigration, you'll be bombarded by all the anti-immigrant videos that you're seeing on YouTube. And we realized this woman, Shauna, who's the head of our digital storytelling program, she realized that there isn't a concerted effort among immigrant rights organizations or people who care about immigrant rights to actually come up with a way to counter all these anti-immigrant narratives on a place like YouTube. So we have a program specifically on that, right? So I think looking at the entire media ecosystem, um, and figuring out, like right now we don't have a theater department or a book department, but I can easily see that that's something that we ought to be pursuing.
Mm. Picking up on something that you said earlier, you mentioned, oh, we're not having this conversation in the immigrant rights movement, about,
Yeah.
how you felt about your mom sending you to America. And I wonder if that's because, in a way, when we acknowledge the ambivalence and the nuance of all of this, it feels like giving an inch to the people that don't want us around, or that, that you have to be very, very pro, very positive, very as um black and white in a way as the other side is, in order to fight that narrative. That it's really hard to make room for nuance. Does that ring true?
Well, but to me, this is this is why storytelling is so crucial, because it's the only place. It may be the only place where nuance is necessary and can exist when two things can happen at once, right?
Hmm.
Talk about another film, Drive My Car. Have you heard about this Japanese film, Drive My Car?
No.
It won the best international features in HBO Max. I mean, when I watched that film, I was like, oh my, I mean, it was just mind blowing, mind blowing. So, talk about nuance. So, I think, look, politicians need to be elected, need to get elected, and they'll say whatever they need to say to get elected, right? That means too often that nuance is not part of the equation. But it means, though, that we have to insist on it. We insist on it at Define American with the stories we tell and that we help tell, right? Like, when you go to our website, it says very clearly we're humanizing the immigrant narrative one story at a time. Um, that is a huge task, right? Huge task. And humanizing means not making any judgment on What if the mom didn't want to send, that anecdote that I just gave? And I remember when I said out loud, when my answer was, yes, I regret it. I would have preferred to stay home. I kept thinking, who else has said that? Where is that story? Right? Is there a movie on that? Is there like,
Mhm.
is somebody, because I think I need to see that, and maybe because right now we're creating policies that in many ways exist in a moral vacuum, right? Um, and sometimes I think the dehumanization of immigrants, um, happens because we haven't heard stories that insist on complexity and nuance. When Trump was president, all I kept thinking was, I don't want any more tragic porn. Whenever you turn on the TV, it was like an immigrant crying, torn from their parent, their families. I mean, it was like, who is this for? So we have this. At the time, we had an artist in residence, Jose Antonio, brilliant man. He coined the term undocujoy just to look at what it means to actually, you know, inhabit, happiness and joyness, and where do we find that? So just even showing, photos of smiling undocumented people was like a way of rebelling.
Mhm.
Was again insisting on nuance and complexity.
Yeah. I want to talk briefly about your new project before
Oh
before we
gosh.
end.
No,
That's not going to be brief, is it?
no,
No, but
no. I'll do it briefly.
yeah, because you mentioned that there wasn't much activism or that the American public didn't seem to care so much about immigrants, and at the same time, we've seen a lot of activism around race relations in America. And I
Yeah.
wonder how the two things connect because not every minority is an immigrant, not every immigrant is a minority. The two
Depending
still,
on which, right?
yeah, and the two still, intersect. And it sounds like that's kind of what you're looking at in your next book, if I read that correctly.
Well, Margaret Atwood wrote a brilliant review of Toni Morrison's book Beloved. You should check it out. It's on Google. Um, and she said that in that review, which I think I partly memorized as I read it so much when I was a kid, she said that an epigraph in a book is like a key to a piece of music, like the key change, right? So I've always put that in because it sets the whole book, right? And in Beloved, it was, I will call them my people who are not my people, and them beloved who are not beloved. That was the epigraph for that. Romans, it's from the Bible. My epigraph for this book is a James Baldwin quote: I'm only black if you think you're white.
Hmm.
I'm only black if you think you're white. So it signals the construction, right? That race is a social construct. But so now that you have the emerging American majority in this country, mostly not black and mostly not white. There are 59 million immigrants in America. In the next 50 years, the 59 million immigrants and their children and descendants will constitute 88% of the population growth, mostly from Asian and Latin countries, right? So where do all these Latin and Asian people fit in this black-white binary? So that's the question I'm trying to answer. And I think I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. This book may really get me deported. People are like, wait, what is he doing now? Can't he just stay in his undocumented lane? What is he doing? Um, but in many ways, I think I'm utilizing every skill I have as a journalist. I love research. I'm the kind of person that I can just spend hours just going over like original sources. So a lot of research, a lot of reportage, a lot of analysis. Um, and this is, I think, in many ways, it's like the culmination of like everything I've learned about being a journalist since I was 17 years old. So I'm working on that right now. I have a really hard deadline, which for any writer is so scary. Um, but yeah, but to me, it's race and immigration together, and you can't really have one without the other, because again, unless you're Native American, unless you're African American descendant of enslaved people, you're an immigrant from somewhere, right? And I think the fact that we have let whiteness as a construct dictate so much of our conversation has been so detrimental to everybody, including white people. Like I'm always like amazed when I meet white people who don't know what kind of white they are. Right? I'm just white. I'm like, wait, what? Are you Irish white? Are you Italian white? Are you German white? Are you like what kind of white? And this book is actually partly inspired by all the young white people I met who had no idea, what kind of white they are. And now in this era of like ancestry.com and 23andMe, I think people are more interested in kind of figuring that out. But I think that lack of awareness about people's specific backgrounds and what they had to face when they got here, it tells you that kind of, Gore Vidal calls it the United States of amnesia, right? Like that kind of, you know, historical indifference has really hurt the country, specifically white people in this country. Because in Europe, people are not white, right? They're British, they're Ukrainian, they're right. It's not like this like white thing. Am I wrong on this?
Well, it's interesting because I'm French, and
Mm.
um, I first came to the US as an exchange student when I was 17 years old, and
Which
I
school did
was
you go to? Which school?
Montclair High School, Montclair, New Jersey.
Ah, yeah.
And I was fascinated actually by meeting all these people who were like, "Oh, I'm French or I'm German or I'm Irish," and then I'm like, "No, like your great grandfather was, your great great
Ah,
grandfather was. Like you're not French. Like you and I don't have." You don't speak my language, you don't know my culture, and then when, you think you're French on, Ancestry Day at the high school, where you put on a beret and you kinda mock and ape my culture, you know? So, I always felt a little I'm like, "Oof, are you French really, though?" So that was my reaction,
that's so interesting.
and, because to me, I'm like, "No, you're American." But I understand that you're of French ancestry or German or whatever, but we don't have the same culture, and you have a lot more in common with a Black American or an Asian American, to me, culture-wise, than you do with me, or at least, before I became Americanized, because I'm quite Americanized now, and maybe we have a bit more in common now. Um, so that was my initial reaction as a French person, and at the same time, you're asking what it's like in Europe. It's complex, right? Because France is not an ethnicity defined country. It's defined by culture and language and values. And so you have a lot of non-white French people. Um, but there is also this conversation that is starting that is in very different terms that is happening in America, and that is long overdue as well. Um,
Huh,
but it's interesting being in the middle of an American defined conversation on race and a French defined conversation on race, which are extremely different
huh.
in many ways. And that could be a whole other conversation.
That's
That
a
could be a
whole
whole
other
other
conversation.
hour. But it's
So,
interesting. Yeah.
well, but that's why I can't. That's why I gotta, I just turned 41, and for the first time in a long time, actually trying to prioritize my health because I may be in my 50s until I see Europe.
Oh,
So I want to make sure I'm able to, like, really, really enjoy
please.
it and see it. I can't wait. I really cannot wait. I
What
cannot wait to, like, you know, see all of that.
if I may, I'm curious actually because, you came out so and
Yeah.
so as undocumented, like a decade ago now, and I've heard you talk about it a lot. I haven't heard you talk so much about the consequences, and usually, we don't really seek out the limelight as immigrants, especially as undocumented immigrants.
Well,
What's your situation these days?
I think the consequences has been I traded a life of like being in the closet as undocumented in limbo to like being a public undocumented person whose life is still in limbo. That's kind of the right. I mean, and in many
Mm.
ways, that's the biggest surprise. I thought that I do this, something happens, nothing happens. Like meaning, I got arrested and detained once. I have to be careful. Clearly, I don't want to, like, I can't go back to the U.S. Mexico border because I'll get arrested. Um, so I can get arrested at any point because I'm undocumented. So I'm kind of just prepared for all of that. But I think the biggest change in me is how do I act like I'm actually free? Like that's the question now. It's like,
Mm.
this is why I bring up Toni Morrison quite a bit because she freed me up as like a eighth grader. So I have to go back to that eighth grader who was free, right? Before I found out I was undocumented, who was free. So my goal is to be as creatively, mentally, intellectually free as I possibly can. Like that has to be borderless. That has to be mine, right? These laws, yeah, I didn't make them. I got to go follow them. I didn't make them, right? Like I can deal with all of that so long as this is free. And I'm telling you, some days I win and some days I don't win. You know?
Seems mad to me that someone as outspoken, as out there as you are in the last decade hasn't, you know, been able to and who's contributed so much hasn't, been able. I feel
Oh,
like at some point some senator would be like, "Yeah, sure, I'll sign something.
oh
I'll sponsor you or
no,
something."
but I think I'd say no to that. I don't
Mm,
think that was a decision I made 11 years ago, right? Like, do I go ask for a private bill
mm,
or do I can't, I mean, that was it again. My decision was I'm one of 11 million people. And mind you, I have quite a few friends who push me on this, who say that maybe it's time to ask for a private bill, like what you're just saying, go to a
yeah.
senator and ask for some sort of a relief for me. I don't know. I just can't wrap my head around that. Especially be, especially because I've met so many undocumented people in this past decade. I'm not sure I could look them in the eye.
Mm.
You know?
Do you have
Yeah.
a path to citizenship residence at this
Nope.
point?
Nope. None. None. Yeah.
Wow.
But hey, like we all have to carry something, and that's this is the thing that I carry.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Jose. It was fascinating. We're a bit over an hour, so I
Yeah.
gotta let you go. But
Yeah, I unfortunately
uh,
have to jump to another meeting. But thank you so much. I'm so glad we did this.
me
And
too, me
hey,
too.
you're gonna give me hopefully by the time I'm able to travel, you're still in London because London is one of my favorite places, at least when I read about it or watch it on TV. Can't wait to see it.
That was Jose Antonio Vargas, journalist, author, filmmaker, founder of Define American, and as he puts it, American without papers. Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation, Jose. He has had his hands in so many fascinating projects. His memoir is Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen, and the next book will be White is Not a Country. He was a producer on the hit play What the Constitution Means to Me, and of course, this conversation referenced a few shows and movies well worth checking out. Superstore, Roswell, The Lost Daughter. I'll be flooding the show notes with links to all of this. As always, please sign up for the newsletter at borderlinepod.com to hear more from me and the podcast. You can also go to isabelrogal.com to check out my other projects and my writing. Given how hard it is to talk right now, there might be more writing and less audio in the next few weeks. But I did record another interview before COVID failed me, one that I'm also super excited to share with a journalist that I met also a decade plus ago. I'm starting to age myself here. When I was working in Cambodia, Thierry Crevelier was covering the Khmer Rouge International Tribunal, same time that I was, though he was doing it far better. He is a specialist on international justice, and we talked specifically about that, about international justice, but not just international criminal courts, though also about that, and Ukraine. We talked about colonial crimes, about reparations, about truth and reconciliation and all the forms that international justice takes. Believe me, it is a fascinating conversation. I cannot wait to edit it and to share it with you. That's next time on Borderline. I'm your host, Isabelle Hogol. Music was by Audionautics. Borderline is a one-lane bridge production. I'll talk to you soon, hopefully with a little bit more breath in my lungs.